So, unlike yesterday's whole morning spent talking about binary, the stuff which we're going to be talking about this morning is directly relevant to the content of the national curriculum because there are explicit requirements about children understanding how the internet works and children understanding how search engines work. So we've got to cover this stuff with children in school. So I think, when you're working with your teachers, then this stuff becomes much, much more relevant. In order to deliver that training well, one would think you kind of need to know what you're talking about yourselves. The afternoon, we're going to talk about the ethical legal side of things, the sense in which that's relevant to the content of the curriculum is kind of up for grabs. E-safety, I'm not really going to deal with very much this afternoon, apart from to nod in its direction. So this morning, we're over here in the purple column. What the World Wide Web and the Internet are, their difference, key features of the web and their relationship, browsers, URLs, navigation methods, data is transported over the Internet, including packets, search engines, what happens when a user requests a web page in a browser. I'm going to talk about at least some of that territory there. So we're into day 4 here, ethics and the Internet. Ethics coming this afternoon, Internet this morning. We're based in London 40 for the whole day, although strictly speaking we're timetable for the big room, but I think it's nicer in here because you've got computers in front of you. So first part of the morning on the Internet, next part of the morning on the web, then we'll have some lunch. Sue Sentence probably joining us somewhere around there. Ethical, legal aspects in the afternoon, planning for D-Day. We can move these around and we can start some of that planning towards the beginning of the afternoon and finish it off later, as I just mentioned. So, as I say, this is directly relevant to the programme of study. More, to be fair, in Key Stage 2 than Key Stage 1, but Key Stage 1 children should be taught to recognise common uses of IT beyond the school. How can you do that and not mention the Internet and the web? If we're thinking of common uses of IT beyond school, then, this is pretty much the most common in my household, or the device like this. So thinking about that sort of mobile technology particularly relevant, but generally the Internet, the web. I tell the story already about my daughter and accessing YouTube. That's at the age of 3. Give it a couple of years when she's into reception class, and heaven knows what she's going to be getting up to. We have, of course, at the last, and about time too, this importance attached to e-safety on the national curriculum, so identifying where to go for help and support when they've got concerns about content or contact on the Internet or other online technologies. Let's just pause for a moment and just think for a moment about what those other online technologies might be.
Xbox, PlayStation.
And how do they work?
You can play online games
Yeah.
people, and through that you can chat to people.
Okay, you're fine. I was thinking more at the sort of technical level of how do they connect, how does one Xbox connect to another Xbox then?
Usually through Wi-Fi or...
Yeah, and then what?
Servers, yeah.
Would that be like using the Internet?
Yeah.
I thought it might. Okay. So what are the other online technologies?
Smart TVs.
And how do they work?
I believe they connect to the internet.
Yes, I do too. So what are the other online technologies that we've got to teach them about now?
iTunes.
Yeah, and that would work via the... Yes, I thought it might. I think this is lazy drafting. We didn't write this paragraph. We safety people wrote this paragraph. And I don't think they knew the difference. I think they meant the web and other online technologies, in which case the 3 answers you just gave all absolutely fine and dandy, where there's a sense in which iTunes uses HTTP as its protocol. If, on the other hand, they mean the Internet and other online technologies, then we are really sort of scraping the barrel to think of other online technologies. There are at least 2 which they could have actually meant. I don't think they did, but would anybody want to have a go at other online technologies other than the Internet, which children in Key Stage 1 ought to be taught to keep themselves safe when using?
Think about Key Stage 1, isn't there a mesh networking?
Yeah, Nintendo DS can do networking without an internet connection. I think it still uses an internet protocol, but they will talk to one another. Took year 6 on a school trip to Paris 5 years ago. Now, and on the bus we had 2 groups essentially. Those who were Apple users, were just listening to their music and having a nice time, and then the DS crowd, who were, of course, we didn't realise they would mesh network, and they're sending chat messages to and fro. Clever. Pupils will cover pupils. Right. So yes, that could be it. Interesting, that wasn't one of my two, but we'll add that onto the list of 3 for future presentations.
The school network.
School network, absolutely. Again, it's likely to use Internet Protocol, but it's not really part of the Internet until we attach it to the Internet. So it could be the school network we're talking
You
about.
know, the BlackBerry.
Yes,
thing.
BBM. Again, it's probably Internet Protocol, but it's not part of the Internet, is my understanding. And generally, your phone is going to be the exception there. Yes, 3G is an Internet connection, but SMS isn't an Internet connection. It's communication which I think is online, but doesn't use the Internet as a way of routing those messages, or at least doesn't have to use the Internet as a way of using those messages. iMessage is an Internet-based protocol, SMS isn't. BBM, I'm not sure about how much BlackBerry use it. Amazing. Still using Blackberries. Okay. So yeah, I think this is just lazy drafting, but it's illustrating the point which we're going to come back to about pretty much everything is the Internet these days. Key stage 2, an explicit requirement. This is the one loads of people are just overlooking. Understand computer networks, including the Internet. If you think you've got your work cut out teaching them to program, or more to the point, if you think the teachers you're working with have got their work cut out teaching them to program, that's nothing compared to understand computer networks, including the Internet. But that's a really ambitious expectation, and it's the one which people aren't looking at. We're focusing so much on coding that people aren't giving enough regard, in my view, to this thing about understanding how the Internet works. Select use combined, there's more to that, which we'll come back to after the break when we're talking about the web. Select use combined a variety of software, including Internet services, that's something they should now be taught to use. Okay, services which use the Internet is something which is there as part of that explicit IT expectation towards the end of the bullet point list. So I go for things like Google Drive. If you want to, simply go and find something on the web. You're using an Internet-based service when you're doing that sort of thing. But cloud-based computing, I'd see that as part and parcel of the expectation there. Okay, so this is the Victorian Internet. We talked a little about relays yesterday, which is Victorian technology. What you have here is an electromagnet and a relay, where the current flows through this particular coil, that pulls the lever down towards it, and the circuit is completed, which can sound a buzzer, which can light I was going to say light a bell, which can light a light. In this case, that pulls it towards it and punches a hole in a little bit of tape. So you have a printout of the bit stream there as it's going through. You have at the far end of this, you've got more relays here. Here is a classical picture of a relay. So what we have is when current flows between ground and this wire, this coil becomes magnetized. That pulls this thing towards it, which closes this circuit, so current flows around these wires from this battery through into this electromagnet here. So that's how a relay works. What I was talking about switches or circuits controlling other circuits. An electronically operable switch last time. This can be a long, long way away. So this wire can be very, very, very long. Or if it's too long, then you just put more relays in between. So you can have the receiver in London and the first switch in the chain in New York. And you press this switch down, current flows, magnets get, switches are completed, more current flows, etc., all the way down the chain until you get to the telegraph office in London, where the thing comes down, the telegraph operator hears the click, and the hole gets punched into the tape door.
I think my dad's got something like this because he worked with cable and wireless in the very early days.
When it was cable rather
when
than
it was
wireless.
actual
Yes.
cable,
Yes,
and they would
absolutely.
have to send the messages, like this. So he's got some of the old cabling boxes.
It's an amazing system. The Victorians had this. Babbage was part and parcel of the team that were working on this sort of thing. The difference engine guy we were talking about yesterday. One of Babbage's interests was how can you communicate securely using this sort of system. Because on this sort of system, yes, it's a point-to-point protocol, but generally the person who writes the message isn't the telegraph operator. The person who reads the message isn't the telegraph operator at the far end. So you're communicating something very secret. You probably want to use a code rather than just say, giving your secret message to Joe Bloggs who works for Cable and Wireless or for the telegraph company or AT&T or wherever. So hence, Babbage being interested in cryptography on this sort of system. It's a point-to-point protocol, and that's worth emphasising. That the cable stretches essentially from the telegraph office in New York to the telegraph office in London. One person communicating along that cable at any one time. Really confusing if the telegraph operator stops receiving one message, starts writing down another message. Yeah? You start a message, you're using all of that cable, you finish the message, somebody else sends their message. Yeah? It's a one message at a time type system, which is how a telephone works. Telephone, again, point-to-point protocol. Well, it used to be, you pick up the receiver at one end, and an electrical circuit is made to the telephone receiver at the other end. Okay, what you have in between is the ability to switch things. So you can dial numbers, or back in the old days, the switchboard operator would move the cable across, so it went to one handset rather than the other handset. Tony, you wanted to interrupt me? Just keep on talking.
No, I was just, before I became a teacher, I worked for Reuters news agency, and their whole history is based on
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Then all of their developments, up to sort of modern day, is all about the advancement of telecommunications.
Yes. And the thing I was talking about yesterday, that information, this is how they were doing it in the Victorian times. Miraculous to the generation before then. Somebody in New York being able to communicate instantly with somebody in London. What an amazing thing. The other thing worth saying is that this, by its very nature, is a binary system. Telephone not so much, but telegraph it's either on or off, which is how binary works. So Samuel Morse came up with the system for encoding letters of the alphabet in on-off signals. The interesting thing which makes this different from ASCII that we were looking at yesterday, well, there are a couple of big differences between this and ASCII. Firstly, the characters are represented by different lengths of representation, I suppose. So an E, which is the most popular letter of the English alphabet, one very, very short pulse switched on. Q, which is much more complicated, long pulse, off, short pulse, off, long pulse, yeah? So you have da, da, di, da to communicate a Q, which is going to take a lot longer than sending D, just to communicate an E there. So you've got sort of a computational efficiency built in to the encoding here. The other thing to look at is, yes, it looks as though there are two symbols there, dits and das. In fact, there are two symbols there, ons and offs. You either have a short on, which is a D, or you have a long on, which is a da, but between both of those there's a short gap. The gaps are an important part of Morse code. Yeah? The off signal is just a time step going through, or a pulse when it's, or a time when it's not connected. So seeing this as binary, it's not the two symbols, the dit and the da. The two symbols are the on and the off, just as they are with binary. If we had more time, we could play around with sending binary messages, Morse code messages to one another. If you've got the kit in school, get a torch, get a switch, put a long wire in between. One child in one room, another child in the other, each with Morse code tables, get them sending good messages. No, sending nice messages to one another. Okay, so you could do this so easily. And in terms of getting children to understand how the internet works, it's not a bad thing to do. So, what is the internet? As with so much of this course, I think it's really helpful to give you a video to show this. And what better place to go for a video to learn about the internet than the IT crowd? I think this is, this deserves a place alongside Phil Bagg's jam sandwiches in all training sessions. Here you go. What is the internet?
What is it? This, Jen, is the internet. Right.
This is the internet. The whole internet.
Yep. I asked for a loan of it so that you could use it in your speech.
small.
That's one of the surprising things about it.
Hang on. It doesn't have any wires or anything.
It's wireless.
Oh yes, everything's wireless nowadays, isn't it? So I can really use it in my speech. What if someone needs it?
Oh no, people will still be able to go online and everything, it'll still work.
Oh, good.
I tell you, you present this to the shareholders and you'll get quite a response.
Can I touch it? Ooh. It's so light.
Of course it is, Jen. The internet doesn't weigh anything.
No, of course it doesn't.
Hey! What is Jen doing with the internet?
Mom said I could use it for my speech.
Are you insane? What if she drops it?
I won't drop it, I'll look after it.
No, Jen, no, this needs to go straight back to Big Ben.
It goes on top of Big Ben, that's where you get the best reception.
Well, I promise I won't let anything happen to it.
No, Jen, I'm sorry, but the elders of the internet would never stand for it.
No, Roy, I spoke to the elders of the internet not 1 hour ago. I told them about Jen winning Employee of the Month, and they were so impressed that they wanted to do whatever they could to help.
Wait a minute. The elders of the internet. The elders of the internet know who I am. You've got to.
No, Jen, I'm sorry, it's just too risky.
Please, Roy.
Well, Moss, has it been completely demagnetized?
By Stephen Hawking himself. Who sends his congratulations, by the way.
Well, if it's okay with the Hawk,
Can I have it?
you can.
Oh, don't forget your speech.
Oh, thank you.
Slowly.
So there you go, Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2 rather, understand the internet, you show them the video, I don't really think you need to do any more than that. Let's just stop now. So what's wrong with that? Okay, it is
It's not funny,
a little
and
flag.
the canned laughter is bad.
It's not wireless.
It ain't wireless, no, and it does weigh something. It weighs a lot, actually. There is a sense in which it is the biggest machine we've made. John Norton puts it very memorably, very well. The internet is the train tracks. It's the infrastructure which connects all of these computers together. So we're looking at the cables, we're looking at the fibre, we're looking at the really smart hardware which passes the connections on, passes the data on from one computer through to the next. The internet can cope with all sorts of things going through it, but essentially it is those connections. The internet is about connecting computers together. The web is just one of the sorts of things which can pass through the infrastructure of the internet. I think it is worth having a go at this. Could you please, on your pads, or on a bit of scrap paper if you'd rather, have a go at drawing the internet? You don't have to do it full size. A representation of is absolutely fine. Look at that. Don't cheat now, Alan, looking at other people's drawings. There you go.
Thank you.
Oh, bless you. Bless you.
Excuse me, sorry.
Do you want to row you, mate?
Right.
Blue paper.
Yes, please.
Okay. Your paper and paper.
Yeah.
You know where to start.
Yeah, I know, that's what I'm doing.
You don't have to draw the whole thing. 5 minutes, no more than that. Okay. I think it's a thing well worth doing. You know, if you're going to do this in school, if you're going to do it with a group of teachers, then get people to draw their representations of the internet. You were all pretty much on the button with that to a greater or lesser extent, with possibly one exception. idea of connecting computers together. I did a little bit of preliminary, so even if you didn't know, you've got a fighting chance with that. If you ask children to do it, or ask colleagues to do it, you'll typically have two answers. One is about connecting computers together, and the other is something about the web. You will see pictures of children who draw a picture of a web browser, or children who draw logos for Google or Facebook or whatever, which is how they think of the internet. It's interesting that Ian's otherwise very good diagram confuses web and internet to some extent. You mark some as www. That's some of the traffic that passes through the internet. You talked about websites. If you talked about web servers, I'd have felt an awful lot more comfortable. I'm sure that's what you meant.
Yeah,
If you were thinking of
websites on
physical
websites,
computers here being connected to other physical, obviously physical computers, other sorts we have at the moment. Yeah, it is connections between machines that we're looking at here. What goes through those connections is pretty much up for grabs. So there's canyoudrawtheinternet.com has a number of these, which it's worth going and looking through. But look at many of these are about connections. Even the www ones or the Facebook ones are about connections. The connections are at the heart of it, really. It is interesting, I think, to go back to the very, very early days. The internet started, well, it's up for grabs exactly when it started, but 1969 is pretty much seen as is commonly agreed as the first, as the date of the birth of the internet, when the first internet message, it was called an IMP, stands for IMP, Internet Message Protocol, Internet Message Server. It's the black box which the first university got to connect it to the rest of the internet when there was no rest of the internet, but you had to start somewhere. One of the phrases you will see described is a network of networks, and friend Pete Kemp is quite keen on emphasising that aspect. So all of the computers here in Roehampton connected together. We'll go and have a look at some of those connections in a moment or three. Roehampton then has one big pipe coming out from it, which connects us to the rest of the university's network and thus to the rest of the internet. Yeah? So you think of these machines here as a network, and then the internet is connecting this network with the other network. So Google servers will form a network. The internet allows their network to connect to our network. Back in the early days, what happened before you got to the black box router, the thing which passed your message from your network onto the rest of the internet, was your business. You could do your network from your house however you wanted to, as long as you had a device which would convert whatever it was you were doing for networking out into a signal which the rest of the internet network, the big network which connects other networks, would understand. These days, all of the internal networks pretty much use the same internet protocols. So we use exactly the same networking system inside the local networks as between the local networks. So each distinct network would stand on its own. It's not any business of the internet what happens inside the network. Communication is on a best effort basis, so we do our level best to get the data across. And it doesn't matter which route we take. That's the idea which Tony has there, that there are multiple pathways here. So it doesn't matter which route you take, you still do your level best to get the data across. The black boxes are what we would now call routers, or gateway machines. They're the bit which needs to interface with however you're doing your local network and how the rest of the internet communicates. So that's the translation there, but we don't need to get it to do the translation. Now, the gateways, the routers, are pretty much, or the intention was that they could be really relatively dumb machines. They need to know which direction to pass the data out in or on from. So a packet is addressed to Steve's machine, it needs to come to Steve's machine. The packet's addressed to Ian's machine, it needs to come to Ian's machine. But you can do that by just looking at the envelope. You don't need to look at the contents of the letter to decide which machine it goes to. Yeah? So the dumb machines, they're not dumb machines, but the routers and switches just look at the letter, the envelope, they don't look at the content and pass it on to the destination. That's now kind of up for grabs when we hear about what GCHQ have been up to, looking at what's inside the packets, and indeed your school network managers will typically do that. There is no single point of failure. If one connection comes down, then it will route to another connection. If one connection is looking very slow, then it can route to another connection, but there is no global control. Most of you have with you today a device that connects to the internet and can act as a hotspot for any other devices in the room. You do not need Vince Cerf's permission to connect to the internet. You don't turn your hotspot on, connect your device to your phone, and then you're connected to the internet. There is no central authority over this. Okay, there are some aspects where there is some element of an agreement there. The protocols are defined, the way the internet communicates. That's something that everybody has to agree to. How the numbers are allocated is something where you need a degree of authority, but that's done on a distributed basis. This organisation can look up to these numbers. The way domain names are allocated is also done on a distributed basis. And if we have anybody who, the elders of the internet, it's the people who decide that sort of root server for the domain names system. This is what it looked like back in 1969. The circles are the internet. When we had just 4 nodes attached to the internet, that was it. Then inside their network, that would be an IBM 360, that would be a PDP-10, obviously don't know what either of those would be, but connected to those internet message protocol black boxes is the rest of that university's network. I suspect in these cases just one big mainframe computer. So a packet from here, PDP-10 at Utah, going to University of California at Santa Barbara, would go via Stanford Research Institution and then on to UCSB, or via UCLA and then on to UCSB. So back in those days it was a relatively easy thing to see how the packets would be passed on. These machines are the routers. They take the packet, say, is it for me? Yeah, pass it on to the computer, in this case the mainframe. Is it not for me? Pass it forward in the obvious, typically in the obvious route. If the obvious route doesn't work, then try a different route, is essentially what it boils down to. Yeah? If it were only that simple these days, we'd all be absolutely fine. Yeah? But back in 1969, I think this was, number 1, UCLA must have been the first one that was connected. And it's like the first fax machine. What are you going to do with that? Let's go for a walk. Have a look at the back of your machine. Stand up, stand up, stand up. You should see coming into your machine a thickish grey cable with some numbers on it, yeah?
Yeah.
That's the internet, or at least that's part of the internet. That's the copper cable, unshielded twisted pairs, which takes data from the network card at the back of your machine and beams that out, or transmits that on, as on-off signals, out to the rest of the internet. So the connection from your computer to the rest of the internet comes through that grey cable. In terms of Morse code operator, 30 words per minute, what's that, 150 characters a minute? That's pretty good going. Yeah, 150 characters a minute, 2.5 characters a second. The cable coming out of the back of the machine there, 12.5 million characters a second. 100 million on-off signals in any 1 second. You don't need all of that capacity to watch even a YouTube clip. Where does it go from there? Comes down underneath the tables into a set of patch panels here. They look a bit like telephone sockets. They're not quite the same as telephone sockets. You can't plug a telephone into one of those and expect it to work properly. So there's copper cable coming out here. That cable is attached directly to the back of your machine. Then from here, it's another sort of copper cable. This stuff is stranded copper, so very, very fine strands of copper all over together. You can bend this very easily. Inside here, we're looking at solid core copper cable, which is probably cheaper to produce, but it's not as flexible. So that goes up into the roof space. Over the roof, come with me, please. Down, so over the roof space, switch. That switch says, I know who that's addressed to, that's addressed to Andy, and that's the strings from him. If it's not addressed to you, it's addressed to either a mail server or Google or whatever, puts the envelope, says not for us, passes on up the chain. From there it goes out all these big measurements go up tiny orange cables. The inside of the orange cables is a it's a plastic one, more like a Well, that bit's going to be brilliant on the tape, isn't it? Okay. So as with any school trip, you go on the trip and then of course you've got to take photographs, you've got to show where you've been. So quickly walking you through some of the illustrations here. As we saw yesterday on the inside of the machine, you're not going to find a network card now. That's dealt with as part of the main motherboard these days. They exist. The one thing I didn't mention, of course, was Wi-Fi. So if you connect to the university Wi-Fi network, your signal is beaming via high-frequency radio waves up to the little Cisco box on the ceiling there, and you will see, because they put in a particularly long lead to make it very clear to us, that there's a white cable going from that to one of those boxes, which looks like a phone port. The rest of the journey is going to be exactly the same as what we've just been talking about. If you're doing a 3G or a 4G connection, slightly different, in that you're going to be connected by a slightly lower frequency radio signal to a mast somewhere nearby, but from there you're back onto the internet. I'm fairly certain that most of the telecoms people will be routing calls via the internet now, rather than via any other sort of network. It's all still fibre. That's a really very close-up view. They're not really that big of what the patch leads look like, which connect your computer to the first port, or inside the big grey box over there, what they look like. I'm fairly certain that there are 8 connections on one of these things, only 4 of them are used. The other 4 is just because that's the cable specification. There are ways of using those connections for other things, so you can, if you really want to, break the standard and double up the number of computers using one run off cable there. The other thing which you can use, which is part of the standard, is to use them for power. So whereas that one which probably is power over Ethernet. So 4 of the cables inside the big white bit of plastic there, 4 of the actual strands of copper will be connecting to the internet. Some of the other strands of copper, you probably only need 2 for it, is providing electricity to the hub. So you don't need 2 separate connections. The cable, so the patch panel that's connected to will be supplying electricity as well as data through to that particular bit of the ceiling, or it could be wired on the inside. It's possible to do it over cabling. That's what a switch looks like. We've looked at switches already. That's the sort of thing you might have on your home network to connect your little hub in your house out to the rest of the internet. So your Ethernet comes in from your switch, and then the DSL line here goes out to the phone system. So you have this as the black box equivalent from the early days of the internet of connecting your network with the rest of the internet. Of course, most home networks now, all you have is a single device which provides Wi-Fi, which provides a few wired connections, and also the cable out to the rest of the internet in whatever form that takes. If you're going with BT, or anybody typically other than Virgin, I would say these days, then the bit between your house and the rest of the internet is done using old-fashioned copper cable, either through your telegraph poles, somebody had telegraph poles drawn in their diagram, or under the street into one of these green cabinets, which you will see scattered around the streets of our country. In there, there's going to be more hardware. Some of the internet companies will rent space inside BT's cabinet and install their own hardware in there, but typically they're just using capacity on BT's network.
I mean, if you've looked in one of these things, they're just really small, the things that are inside the boxes. The racks of...
I'm sure every now and then I see one that's unlocked.
Yeah.
And swinging
They're supposed to be
like,
too.
that is quite dangerous.
Yeah, they do.
Then literally like this one, you can just, can you imagine?
Yeah, BT engineers seem to do that fairly randomly where we live. But in there you'll have the thing which does what our box next door does, and take all of those copper cables and aggregate them into fibre cables. The data is what matters here, and the fact it's being transmitted via fibre just means you can get more of it through. This is closer to domestic fibre, but we're talking about 1,000 million on-off signals a second going through one of those things. There is capacity for 10,000 million signals a second going through fairly standard fibre. This is the one in Godalming. It looks pretty decrepit, but again, BT own the equipment in there which will take all of those fibre signals and aggregate that up into more fibre going out. So it's a tree-like system. We're looking at the leaves at the end of the branches, at the end of bigger branches here. From there, that will go off to other places. Again, in there, you will have equipment owned by different providers. The BT equipment will send it off along, it's all BT's cable typically, but the equipment will go off in one direction if it's BT dealing with it, off in another direction if it's somebody else dealing with it. Yeah? There's still, smart-ish sort of hardware in there. So you had, who was it who had UK Hub on their diagram? Was that Chris? Yeah, that's pretty much it. This is the UK Hub. Okay, it's not the single point of failure. There are going to be other ways of getting data to and fro, as Tony has been was mentioning on his diagram. But essentially, all of the big UK internet providers, including Janet, including BT, including all of the Virgin, and all of the rest, will rent space inside the London Internet Exchange, which is on Docklands, and they'll have their big main switches for the UK in that sort of physical space there. They'll connect to one another at that point. So there'll be a cable that runs from the BT switch to the Virgin switch. And the BT switch will say, oh, that's a packet for somebody on the Virgin network, and that data will travel through a fairly big bit of fibre, I would expect it, onto Virgin switch, and then Virgin will pass that on to whichever bit of their local network or their UK-wide network is attached there. If you watch EastEnders and look up from the Millennium Dome, O2 Arena on the photograph, you'll see it just almost due north of the Millennium Dome. There are a number of buildings on the site though. If memory serves, this is Links, London Internet Exchange. This is Global House, this is Global Switch. Big green on-off button as their logo. If you go to Excel on the Docklands Railway, you see this building with a big green on-off logo, and that's Global Switch. I don't think if you press the logo, the internet turns on. Telehouse here. What's happening in those other buildings? That's not so much the switch gear of connecting networks together. That's people building computers really, really close to the connections. So if you're serving a UK network, or if you want to monitor a UK network, then that's a really sensible place to put your servers. Because the connection between there and the London Internet Exchange is going to be a fairly short one. So direct connection into the London Internet Exchange means sort of co-locating at least some of your equipment there. The finance companies are the ones who are really interested in this short travel time, as we talked about. This building, it's a travel lodge. So if you want to go and stay at the internet, that's your best bet. Okay, you go to the bet show and want to sleep over, I'd say go to Telehouse. I don't know what the internet connection's like, but it should be reasonably fast. And then underground cables, again we're talking, typically it's going to be stuff BTO, but it could be other people who own it, out into Cornwall for the Atlantic crossing. This is where Cable and Wireless...
That's where my dad trained.
Absolutely, yes! They had their training college.
It's
It's wonderful. And that's where the first transatlantic telegraph cables were landed. And it's still our first point of contact to the rest of the transatlantic internet there. So you can see the original telegraph huts over the left, right hand side of the paper. They're not using those huts, photo. Now, they're not using those huts so much now. The undersea cable, you can go and do a zoomable Google map from telegeography. Notice how much traffic there is transatlantic. Notice also how much there is trans-Pacific. How come Russia's not connected? Because that's going to be underground rather than undersea cabling to connect. But the undersea cabling is some of the interesting stuff. Most of Africa, again, I suppose you've got connections underground potentially or overground. But coastal Africa now very, very well served by internet connections to the rest of that global internet. And then at the far end, the process is not so much reversed, but there'll be a big, big cable from the New York equivalent of the London Internet Exchange out to Google's server farms, and then Google will deal with that themselves once the data hits their server farms. I'll show you some more of that later. How are we doing for time? Not too bad. This is 12 minutes. This is Andrew Bloom talking you through some of this journey as a TED Talk. Fingers crossed. Is that working now?
I've always written primarily about architecture, about buildings. And writing about architecture is based on certain assumptions. An architect designs a building and it becomes a place, or many architects design many buildings and it becomes a city. And regardless of this complicated mix of forces of politics and culture and economics that shapes these places, at the end of the day, you can go and you can visit them. You can walk around them, you can smell them, you can get a feel for them, you can experience their sense of place. But what was striking to me over the last several years was that less and less was I going out into the world, and more I was sitting in front of my computer screen. And especially since about 2007, when I got an iPhone, I was not only sitting in front of my screen all day, but I was also getting up at the end of the day and looking at this little screen that I carried in my pocket. And what was surprising to me was how quickly my relationship to the physical world had changed. In this very short period of time, whether you call it the last 15 years or so of being online, or the last 4 or 5 years of being online all the time, our relationship to our surroundings had changed, and that our attention is constantly divided. We're both looking inside the screens and we're looking out in the world around us. And what was even more striking to me, and what I really got hung up on, was that the world inside the screen seemed to have no physical reality of its own. If you went and looked for images of the internet, this was all that you found. This famous image by Opti of the internet as the kind of Milky Way, this infinite expanse where we don't seem to be anywhere on it. We can never seem to grasp it in its totality. It's always reminded me of the Apollo image of the Earth, the blue marble picture. And it's similarly meant to suggest, I think, that we can't really understand it as a whole. We're always sort of small in the face of its expanse. So if there was this world in the screen, and if there was the physical world around me, I couldn't ever get them together in the same place. And then this happened. My internet broke one day, as it occasionally does, and the cable guy came to fix it, and he started with the dusty clump of cables behind the couch, and followed to the front of my building, into the basement, and out to the backyard, and there was this big jumble of cables against the wall. And then he saw a squirrel running along the wire, and he said, "There's your problem. A squirrel is chewing on your internet." And this seems astounding. The internet is a transcendent idea. It's a set of protocols that has changed everything, from shopping to dating to revolutions. It was unequivocally not something a squirrel could chew on. But that, in fact, seemed to be the case. A squirrel had, in fact, chewed on my internet. And then I got this image in my head of what would happen if you yanked the wire from the wall, if you started to follow it. Where would it go? Was the internet actually a place that you could visit? Could I go there? Who would I meet? Was there something actually out there? And the answer, by all accounts, was no. This was the internet, this black box with a red light on it, as represented in the sitcom The IT Crowd. Normally, it lives on the top of Big Ben, because that's where you get the best reception. But they had negotiated that their colleague could borrow it for the afternoon to use in an office presentation. The elders of the internet were willing to part with it for a short while. And she looks at it and she says, "This is the internet? The whole internet? Is it heavy?" They said, "Of course not. The internet doesn't weigh anything." And I was embarrassed. I was looking for this thing that only fools seem to look for. The internet was that amorphous blob, or it was a silly black box with a blinking red light on it. It wasn't the real world out there. But in fact, it is. There is a real world of the internet out there, and that's what I spent about 2 years visiting, these places of the internet. I visited large data centers that use as much power as the cities in which they sit. And I visited places like this, 60 Hudson Street in New York, which is one of the buildings in the world, one of the very short list of buildings, but a dozen buildings, where more networks of the internet connect to each other than anywhere else. And that connection is an unequivocally physical process. It's about the router of one network, of Facebook, or Google, or BT, or Comcast, or Time Warner, whatever it is, connecting with usually a yellow fiber optic cable up into the ceiling down to the router of another network. And that's unequivocally physical, and it's surprisingly intimate. These buildings like 60 Hudson and a dozen or so others has 10 times more networks connecting within it than the sort of next tier of buildings. So there's a very short list of these places. And 60 Hudson in particular is interesting because it's home to about a half dozen very important networks, which are the networks that serve the undersea cables that travel underneath the ocean, that connect Europe and America, and connect all of us. And it's those cables in particular that I want to focus on. If the internet is a global phenomenon, if we live in a global village, it's because there are cables underneath the ocean, cables like this. And in this dimension, they are incredibly small. You can hold them in your hand. They're like a garden hose. But in the other dimension, they are incredibly expansive as you can imagine. They stretch across the ocean. They're 3 or 5 or 8,000 miles in length. And if the material science and the computational technology is incredibly complicated, the basic physical process is shockingly simple. Light goes in on one end of the ocean and comes out on the other. And it usually comes from a building called a landing station that's often tucked away inconspicuously in a little seaside neighborhood. And they're amplifiers that sit on the ocean floor that look kind of like bluefin tuna. And every 50 miles, they amplify the signal. In the sense that the rate of transmission is incredibly fast. The basic unit is a 10 gigabit per second wavelength of light, maybe 1,000 times your own connection. You're capable of carrying 10,000 video streams. But not only that, but you'll put not just one wavelength of light through one of the fibers, but you'll put maybe 50 or 60 or 70 different wavelengths or colors of light through a single fiber. And then you'll have maybe 8 fibers in a cable, 4 going in each direction. And they're tiny, they're the thickness of a hair. And then they connect to the continent somewhere. They connect in a manhole like this. Literally, this is where the 5,000-mile cable plugs in. This is in Halifax, a cable that stretches from Halifax to Ireland. And the landscape is changing. 3 years ago, when I started thinking about this, there was one cable down the western coast of Africa, represented in this map by Steve Song as that thin black line. Now there's 6 cables and more coming, 3 down each coast. Because once a country gets plugged in by one cable, they realize that it's not enough. If they're going to build an industry around it, they need to know that their connection isn't tenuous but permanent. Because if the cable breaks, you have to send a ship out into the water, throw a grappling hook over the side, pick it up, find the other end, and then fuse the 2 ends back together and then dump it over. It's an intensely physical process. So this is my friend Simon Cooper, who very recently worked for Tata Communications, the communications wing of Tata, the big Indian industrial conglomerate. And I never met him. We've only communicated via this telepresence system, which always makes me think of him as the man inside the internet. And he is English. The undersea cable industry is dominated by Englishmen, and they all seem to be 42. Because they all started at the same time with the boom about 20 years ago. And Tata had gotten its start as a communications business when they bought 2 cables, one across the Atlantic and one across the Pacific, and proceeded to add pieces onto them until they had built a belt around the world, which means they will send your bits to the east or the west. This is literally a beam of light around the world. And if a cable breaks in the Pacific, it'll send it around the other direction. And then having done that, they started to look for places to wire next. They looked for the unwired places, and that's meant north and south, primarily these cables to Africa. But what amazes me is Simon's incredible geographic imagination. He thinks about the world with this incredible expansiveness. And I was particularly interested because I wanted to see one of these cables being built. See, all the time online we experience these fleeting moments of connection, these sort of brief adjacencies, a tweet or a Facebook post or an email. And it seemed like there was a physical corollary to that. It seemed like there was a moment when the continent was being plugged in, and I wanted to see that. And Simon was working on a new cable, WAX, the West Africa cable system, that stretched from Lisbon down the west coast of Africa to Cote d'Ivoire, to Ghana, to Nigeria, to Cameroon. And he said it was coming soon, depending on the weather, but he'd let me know when. And so with about 4 days' notice, he said to go to this beach south of Lisbon, and a little after 9, this guy will walk out of the water. And he'll be carrying a green nylon line, a lightweight line called the messenger line. And that was the first link between sea and land, this link that would then be leveraged into this 9,000-mile path of light. Then a bulldozer began to pull the cable in from this specialized cable landing ship. And it was floated on these buoys until it was in the right place. And you can see the English engineers looking on. And then once it was in the right place, he got back in the water holding a big knife, and he cut each buoy off, and the buoy popped up into the air, and the cable dropped to the seafloor. And he did that all the way out to his ship. And when he got there, they gave him a glass of juice and a cookie, and then he jumped back in, he swam back to shore, and he listened. And then once that cable was on shore, they began to prepare to connect it to the other side. The cable had been brought down from landing. First they got it with a hacksaw, and then they start sort of shaving away the plastic interior with sort of working like chefs, and then finally they're working like jewelers to get the paraffin fibers to line up with the cable that had come down, and with this hole punch machine they fuse it together. And when you see these guys going at this cable with a hacksaw, you stop thinking about the internet as a cloud. It starts to seem like an incredible physical thing. And what surprised me as well was that as much as this is based on the most sophisticated technology, as much as this is an incredibly new thing, the physical process itself has been around for a long time, and the culture is the same. You see the local laborers, you see the English engineer giving directions in the background. And more importantly, the places are the same. These cables still connect these classic port cities, places like Lisbon, Mombasa, Mumbai, New York. And then the process on shore takes around 3 or 4 days. And then when it's done, they put the manhole cover back on top. And they push the sand over that, and we all forget about it. And it seems to me that we talk a lot about the cloud, but every time we put something on the cloud, we give up some responsibility. We're less connected to people worry about it. And that doesn't seem right. There's a great Neil Stephenson line where he says that wired people should know something about wires. And we should know, I think, we should know where our internet comes from. And we should know what it is that physically connects us all. Thank you.
It's good, isn't it?
So this is the idea of a massive cable. Mind-blowing.
And if you're going to do, or if you're going to have teachers who are going to do people who help us, great Key Stage 1 topic. People who help us? The guy from BT, the guy who drags the cable ashore to connect a country to the internet. Oh, absolutely. Now, the geography is really interesting. Remember, well, we're not talking about IP addresses yet, but IP geolocation, really, really interesting. So each computer connected to the internet directly has a unique number, and you can look those numbers up and find them on a map. The level of detail is kind of hidden from you, but this is what numbers look like. At the moment, most of us are using IP version 4. Your home wireless access point, router, whatever it's called, is likely to be something like 192.168.0.1 or 192.168.1.254 or something like that, depending on who makes it. That's a local address. On the outside, though, it's got another address, which is where the internet will find it. When somebody wants to send you a little packet of a YouTube video or whatever, that envelope is coming with the address of your house's internet access point labelled on it. And they look like that. Problem is, we've now connected so many devices directly to the internet that we've kind of run out of numbers for it. We still, they've all been allocated to other people who are now allocating all of those numbers. So the massive, there is no pool lying at internet headquarters, as if there was such a thing, of unallocated addresses. So we switched over, we're switching over onto IP version 6, which allows much, much, much more address space and will keep us going. There's more address space there than there is atoms in the known universe. We're going to have a go at simulating the internet now. Rather than using the full sort of dotted quad notation for IP addresses, we're just going to stop it down to a 10-point internet running from 11 through to 25. I'm going to allocate these. I need 2 people to be our routers, though, who are going to deal with the switches for their local network. Tony, are you happy to be 2-1? So you're running the whole of the 2-dot network, and Steve, are you happy to be 1.1? Yep. So you're running the whole of the 1.1, or the 1-dot network. Over down this side of the room, we've got 1.5, 1.4, 1.3, and 1.2. 2, and then join your 2.5, and then Ian 2.4, and then Joe 2.3. I'll have 2.2 for what it's worth. So you've each got your own real unique address on the internet there. Now, the data that travels through the internet, unlike the telegraph that I talked about right at the start, you're not hogging the line for all of the time. You take your message, your information, data, and break it up into small packets. Typically 1,500 characters in a packet, but the rules allow a lot more than that. Those packets have a lot of metadata attached at the front. The actual data comes at the tail end of the packet, and here's the information inside the envelope, but the envelope has a lot of information there on the front of it. I talked about the time to live, so how many hops does it take before you give up and send the thing all over again? What sort of system are you using to communicate inside the packet? Where is it going to? Where is it coming from? How long is all of the data in the packet? There's also going to be a number, failing to see where it's going to be set here, which says identification data, which says which packet in the sequence it is. So when all of the bits for your YouTube video arrive at your computer can put them back together in the right order. When you send the email off to Google server or wherever, then at the far end those packets need to be put back into the right order before Google can make head or tail of what it is you've sent. We're going to use a simpler form of this. I would have printed these out, but I'm struggling to get the printer working from this machine. You're going to need 4 fields on each of these strips of paper. You're going to send 3 packets each. Okay, so you're going to take a message. It could be a short sentence, doesn't have to be anything sophisticated. Break it up into 3 sections. Write it onto one of these slips of paper, each section. So, good morning, it's a lovely day. Good morning, it's a lovely day. As 3 packets to make up the message. Does that make sense so far? Okay. Onto this, you need to write the packet number. Is it first of 3, second of 3, third of 3, so that they're going to put back into the right order at the far end. You also need to say who you're sending it to, from 11 up to 25, and you need to put your sender number on there as well. So it's a little postcard. It's this number in the sequence, it's sent to this address, it's coming from this address, and this is the fragment of the message. Does that make sense? Kind of what's happening inside your network card. We're making a number of assumptions here. This is not exactly how they work, but it's close enough to give you a feel for what's going on. So you're going to need 3 slips of paper. You're going to need to choose somebody to write to. Remember, all 3 are going to the same person. Okay, don't confuse it by doing something other than that. You can be thinking what your message is. Okay, go. So everybody got 3 slips of paper? Yeah? Okay. Make it clear where it's going to, where it's coming from. So, 1, 3, from, 2, 2. destination addresses. Good. Looking good. 2 packets already.
Yeah.
Okay. Need to make sure your destination address goes on.
Yeah.
And this packet 1, packet 2, packet 3.
Or 1.1.
Packet 1 of
One
the
of.
packet number is where it comes in the sequence. So
Okay,
that
so
would be
one.
first of 3, second of 3,
Okay.
third of 3.
Yeah.
Right? And make sure you've got a destination address on them. Okay. All well. Still writing messages. Go later. It's good. Some message coming soon. Sent from 1 2 to 1 4. That's fine. Okay. Right. Next bit is where you've got to make a decision if you're going to do this with children, between simulating the internet and giving instructions in a reasonably clear sort of way. Because the packets would arrive at any time in semi-random sequence and be dealt with as they arrive. Once you've got them used to how the system works, you can swap to that mode, or you can give them very clear instructions to how to do it in that mode. But the first time round, it is easier to get everybody doing the same thing at the same time. And that's not how the internet works, except when it's something which we all want to see pretty much at the same time. So, anybody who's got an IP address beginning with a 1, yeah? No. Where your own IP address is beginning with a 1, which are you 4, you've got to pass all of your packets to your switch, which is Steve. So just pass him all of the packets, any order you want. Anybody with an IP address beginning with a 2, you've got to pass your packets to Tony, who is your switch. There you go. Dawn's connection to Tony seems to be a fairly...
Yeah.
Steve, hold on.
I'm rejecting it.
Oh!
Designation.
Oh.
That's nicely done. Well done. Right. So you're 2. So you're not connected to him. Right?
2.
Sorry. Next diagram makes this a little clearer. Anybody with a 1 address is only connected to Steve. Anybody with a 2 address, which includes me, can I give you my phone? Right. Anybody with a 2 address is only connected to Tony. Steve and Tony are connected back to you, but crucially to one another as well, which allows you all to communicate. Yep. Steve and Tony, now you've got your first job is to sort out the ones which you can deal with yourself on your own network, and the ones which you're going to have to pass to one another. So sort your packets out into ones addressed to, in your case, well, in both cases, 1 and 2 networks. Yeah, got that? So those are all of your 2 packets are coming to Tony. Okay, so they're all addressed to network 1. They're all addressed to network 2. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, you guys now have the job of delivering those packets back to the original, back to their destination address.
So we're the postman.
You're the postman, essentially, yeah. And that's exactly what the switch would do. The switch would look at the destination address, pass that on to the IP address that it belongs to. When it gets to the destination, you've now got the job of reassembling the message to make sense of what it was you sent. Hopefully that's going to work. Well, yeah, that's the thing. No guarantee that there's anything on the internet for you. Right. You have a message that makes sense?
Yes.
That's a relief. Right.
Oh, you're pretty lucky today. He's doing his. Oh, look at that, it's your birthday. Should I have given them to him in the right
No,
way?
you just give them out. He sorts that out when they get to him.
Okay.
You don't have to sort out the ordering of the packets, that's not your job.
So these 2 guys, routers.
These 2 guys are routers and switches.
Routers
Yeah?
and
Switches is when they're dealing with, they've got information, can they pass it back? What Tony's doing at the moment is the job of a switch.
Oh.
Yeah? But the switch also says if I can't deal with this myself, I pass it on to somebody who can. In this case, the only person to pass it to is me. Okay. Backups. What is packet 1, packet 2, packet 3. Thank you very much. He was my source for that. That's going to be you, isn't it? That's very good. Ah, wow. What do you think about the simulation? Could you do this with children? Could you do this with teachers?
Yeah.
Okay, any suggestions for how you can make it better?
You've got a bigger class, have more, so you have a 3-point as well.
Yeah. With a group of students, we actually have 4 routers.
Okay.
The diagram looks a little bit more complicated. So doing 7 people, doing 4 networks each with 7 machines on works fine, I think. Yeah. The other thing you can do is add in bits in between these two. Yeah. This assumes a direct connection between Tony and Steve, like there would be inside links. Yeah. So if you're both switches living inside London Internet Exchange, you just pass those packets to the network that it's destined for. Yeah. The internet doesn't necessarily work like that because there isn't always a direct physical connection here. So between here and here is the rest of the internet. I've represented this in this occasion as one single cable, but you could have loads and loads of children taking each of those packets to their destination or just passing it on to somebody who's a little bit closer if you go along with it as a class. And that makes it a little bit more authentic. The one thing this captures, which many of the other simulations you'll find out there don't, is this crucial role for the switches. First time we tried it with a group of trainees, we just had them all communicating peer-to-peer with one another, which is really inefficient. Second time round, we identified switches for each of 4 groups. They worked an awful lot better, as the internet does. Connecting all 28 computers, connecting all 2.8 billion computers to one another, think about the amount of wire that would be involved. Connecting them to just one other, making a daisy chain, think how long it would take for the message to get there. But this tree-like network, if you all connect to one point, that point connects to the other networks, is what the internet got so right. Any other suggestions for how to improve this?
You make different different groups into a country.
Yeah.
You get a theme. They're sending messages about particular things.
The Russian internet, the Ukrainian internet, we're not talking to one another. The Chinese internet, we're not talking to anybody. Just pass the messages around one another.
From my point of view, it needs to be much more visual, so I would probably have colour codes,
Oh, yes, okay.
And these 1.2, 1.3 would be one colour card, the others, so I can see the colours going across as well.
Yeah, that's nice.
Or even, I was thinking even the messages that you send could be actual messages taken off the internet. That's simple things like that.
Right, okay.
Generally, no.
Yeah. So yes, you can. I mean, there's a lovely simulation out there from Chris Leach at the school up in Northamptonshire, where the message that goes via the internet is, "Can you send me this web page?" And then, which is an HTTP GET request. And the thing that comes back is the first bit of content of the website, of the web page. So you, rather than just breaking it up as a message, which confuses it a little with instant messaging and email, you could actually have a properly formatted HTTP GET request, and coming back you can be the response of a web server saying, "Here is this content of your website." That would work.
I was thinking of another idea. I'd probably do this in a really large space in the hall.
Yeah.
With coloured hoops on the ground, so Tony stands in
Yeah.
yellow hoop, we all stand in red hoops, and then we have strings connectors. So
Yes.
you
You can only pass messages along the
string.
string. Oh, that's lovely.
It's that real concrete
Really
kind of.
like
It's a
that's
real
even
thing.
better than Judith's hat idea. If you don't
See, I was
mind
going to
saying so.
say maybe using actual envelopes and they can
No.
have a picture.
Postcards, not envelopes.
Okay, so
Seriously.
that's
Did you notice that Steve and Tony could read all of your messages? Yeah? There is no privacy. The only way you could have stopped Steve and Tony finding out what you were saying to the other person is agreeing a code in advance. For if Mark lets us communicate with one another, we're going to use this code during the session. Yeah? The whole thing is, there is no privacy on the internet. The switches, if the switches are interested in reading your messages, they can do that. Originally back in Vint Cerf Day, you didn't have the processing power to do that. These days, of course you do. Your school network manager can read the messages that are going through your school switch. Yeah? Okay, anybody else? Fine. More slides to show. Let's see how we can do. Yeah, you can't easily do these things on most school computers. I think I can on this one, but I'm not absolutely sure as to whether I'm allowed to run a command prompt, and if I am, what I can do with it. But there are simple text-based command line tools which let you test how a computer's networking is set up and test the connection between one computer and another. The starting one is this thing called ifconfig or ipconfig. On a Windows machine, you're dealing with ipconfig. And this brings out the diagnostic information about this particular computer's network card. So it's saying that my Ethernet adapter to the local area network, my IP address is 10.151.197.1. Anything that begins with a 10 is a local network address. It's not connected to the internet directly, like your 192.168 is probably on your home network. And that tells me exactly where it is. Now, my default gateway says if it's not a packet for somebody else in the room, then anything else you get sent to 10.151.197.254, which will be the smart switch in the room next door. So anything which isn't destined for here goes out to there. Don't worry too much about subnet masks and so on. Notice we've also got an IP version 6 address just in case we need the space there. The version up on the screen there is the one from my laptop on the home network. Ping sends one tiny packet of data. Remember, a typical packet of data, 1,500 characters. This is just 56 characters, which is basically enough room to get the header information in there to a destination that you specify. So if I type in ping www.google.com, it will send 56 bytes of data as close as it can get to Google and tell me how long it takes to get there. And that's what happens. Request timed out. Does this mean that Google is inaccessible? Google is down? Probably not. Yeah? What's happened is that the university is blocking ping traffic. So the university is checking what sort of information is it in this packet. If it says it's labelled as a ping, then the university is saying, I'm not letting that go through. So even here, we can't test our connection using ping out as far as Google. But you never know, your school network might be set up to allow that. My home network obviously is, and so sending, this is last night, sent a packet 56 bytes of data from home to Google, typically taking 10 milliseconds to get there. Yeah? If you look up the geolocation, if you say, where is this IP address in the world, it's okay, it says that's in Mountain View, California, which is where Google is based. Do that on a map. Is it 5,000 miles between Godalming and Mountain View, California? Something like that. Divide that distance by 10 milliseconds, the time it takes to get there, and you end up with a speed of 500,000 miles per hour. Miles per second, beg pardon, 500,000 miles per second. Anybody notice anything odd about that number?
Fast. Yeah, it's a bit like 186,000.
Yeah.
Twice as fast as light.
It's, 2.5 times as fast as the speed of light. Does that worry you at all?
Slightly.
Yeah, it's not. Given that most of the distance is travelling as light in fibre, how can Google get packets of data to arrive 2.5 times quicker than the speed of light when Einstein had said that information cannot travel faster than the speed of light? As you will have heard on television, it cannot change the laws of physics. Sorry. It's proof if we ever needed one that they are actually aliens from the future to come back. You can tell the children that. What you've got there is actually the IP geolocation lines. But Google is doing smart stuff on their switches. London Internet Exchange will say, yeah, if it's destined for this particular IP address, route it to that server. So that particular IP address will cover a whole multitude of servers which will be more locally located. So that's probably somewhere over in Ireland or something like, Ireland is cheap and internet spaces alone. So the IP geolocation thing is not absolutely reliable, and Google will have clever ways around that. Traceroute is even more fun, and of course the University Network won't let me run a traceroute. Traceroute does ping, but pings each stop along the way. Remember, as the packets are going through each of those routers switches on the internet, each of those can send back a little bit of data saying, this is where I am, this is my IP address. So, from my home machine, 192.168 type address, it goes to probably the switch in the green cabinet down the bottom of my road, it goes to the switch in the local phone exchange, then blah-de-blah-de-blah, eventually it will get to telehouse. So somewhere down the line here, item hops number 8 and 9, we're at something like faraday.ukcore.bt.net. That sounds to me as though that's a big switch somewhere inside London Internet Exchange. Out from there, we're going to this cloud.selection, and then we're going to various destination addresses. So out from the BT network, didn't take too long at all to hit the BetShow's web server, which is what I was trace routing to on this occasion. If you want to, you can link this to the geolocation stuff. So you have the IP addresses of every hop along the route. You can use a geolocation tool to find out where those computers are and plot that on a world map of this is where my data goes from my school computer to the BetShow's web server or wherever, which is probably Germany. Yeah. And you could, the geolocation stuff isn't accurate, but you could still do the exercise. The domain name system is really interesting. So betshow.com is something which we can remember, but as you've heard already, what we're actually interested in is the IP address of that computer. And that translation from the name that we remember into an IP address is done by the domain name system. You firstly have to register the domain name. So the BetShow people here have registered this. In fact, it's been registered by Ascio Technologies, Inc. They last updated it on the 14th of October 2013. It was set up in July 2000. That took them a while to get on the internet. We were on the internet before that as a school. Expires 19th of July next year. Watch that date. If they don't renew it, you could go and grab that domain name off them and declare yourself the BetShow. And they have then, as part of this registration record, declared a number of authoritative name servers. If you want to know where our computer is, its IP address, then this is the best place to ask. This particular computer, which is connected to, which is serving domain name lookups, will be the people to ask. And you can run a command to do that. NSLOOKUP is the name server lookup. So this is saying, could you look up the name www.betshow.com using the authoritative name server here? And so it comes back with this is the authoritative internet address for that particular name. I say authoritative because most of this is cached. The little black box you have in your cupboard connected to the internet will keep copies of the most recent DNS lookups that it's done. So you don't have to keep going back to the authoritative name server. Your internet service provider will keep the most recent ones it has been asked for, rather than having to keep going back to the one authoritative domain server. It's an amazing distributed system. It's also really, really not easy to hack, but this is the weakest. In many ways, this is the weakest point of the chain. If somebody can pollute your DNS records so that www.lloydsbank.com doesn't point to Lloyds Bank's web server, but points to the Russian mafia web server, then how would you know that that's happened? And there are ways of now signing DNS records to make sure that actually it is certified by somebody who knows that, whose word we take for that. And they do actually physically meet and sign one another's keys, or cryptographic keys. As I say, on this computer it's hard to do some of these things because the university network is set up that way. On your school computers, you're very unlikely to be able to run many of these commands. Talk to your network manager and say you demand access to the command prompt. It's a safe thing to do. Just because I've got access to the command prompt does not mean to say I can nuke all of my hard disk. You saw yesterday that I can look at the bits inside the Excel executable, but I can't change any of those. Your network manager should have set it up in such a way that you can see but you can't touch, I suppose. With a Raspberry Pi, you've got that level of control. You can run those commands. But again, if the network's been set up so as to stop ping traffic going through, you won't be able to run it even there. The last thing to end on current affairs at the moment, we had right from the start this idea of net neutrality, that Tony and Steve, as our two switches, they passed on all of the packets they were given. They weren't saying, that one's for Dawn, that's not important, I'll just leave that for a while. Yeah? Or they weren't saying, Joe's paid me extra to make sure that her packets come through very, very quickly. So that's priority traffic. They just passed on the packets as they arrived. And that's been the principle we've applied pretty much throughout the history of the internet. Just this last week, the American FCC has said, well, that's not so important anymore. If the internet providers want to come to special arrangements with particular clients to prioritize or to downgrade their traffic, then we'll let them do that. So this principle of net neutrality, that it doesn't matter what's in the packet, we just get it through to its destination as fast as we can. It's kind of, in America at least, we're getting pretty much close to the point where it's not something that applies. The other aspect of that, of course, is that the content of the packet can be anything. It can be your email, it can be copyrighted material which you've got no right to pass on to somebody else. It can be porn, it can be plans for, sorry, this is all on the tape, isn't it? It can be plans for terrorist attacks. But the packet, the internet is designed to allow those packets through. Okay, we know that we can check what's going in those packets, but the idea was it doesn't matter what the content is, the internet just routes it. Right from the start, it had this principle of freedom and equity built in. There are some who feel that that's not necessarily the best possible thing. Yeah? We have now a position where the worst of the porn on the internet is not something which home domestic internet providers will provide you with access to. That sort of packets don't get treated the same as other sorts of packets. But where do you draw the line on that? Somewhere perhaps between where we've drawn the line and say images of child abuse isn't an acceptable content for the internet, and somewhere where China's drawn the line of saying, well, access to Twitter, access to Facebook, no, that's not something which we want coming into our country's internet. Somewhere between the two might be the right place. I don't know. It's an interesting ethical issue, which is this afternoon's conversation. And a mere 20 minutes over the length which we were planning it to be. Do you want to go and get yourself a coffee, a cup of tea, some, have a break? We'll start again at about 25
Yep.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah, just let me stop the thing.